The silver tray in Elena's hands didn't tremble, even as the sub-zero Vermont wind rattled the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, threatening to break the fragile silence of the Sterling estate. Inside, the air smelled of expensive beeswax, aged mahogany, and the faint, bitter scent of antiseptic that always seemed to linger near the east wing. Elena Vance moved like a ghost through the grand corridors. At 32, she had mastered the art of being invisible. To the world, she was just the maid in the crisp gray uniform, the woman who polished the brass and kept the dust from settling on Arthur Sterling's vast collection of first-edition books. No one in Silveridge knew that her hands, now rough from cleaning supplies, had once been the steadiest in a high-volume emergency room in Boston. No one knew that she had traded her nursing scrubs for an apron only after the system she served had failed her and her mother. As she entered the library to dust the bookshelves, her fingers lingered for a moment on a thick medical encyclopedia. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a silent relic of a life she'd been forced to leave behind. Elena. The voice was small, thin, and weary. She turned to see Noah, Arthur's 6-year-old son, curled in a massive leather armchair. The boy was supposed to be reading about winter birds, his favorite hobby, but the book lay forgotten on his lap. Elena's heart tightened. Over the last 3 weeks, she had watched the light fade from the boy's eyes. He was pale, not the healthy paleness of a winter morning, but a waxy, translucent shade. Most concerning to her trained eyes was the strange, bronze tint deepening around his knuckles and the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a tan, it was a warning. "Are you tired today, little bird?" she asked softly, kneeling beside the chair. She used the respectful tone required of her position, yet her voice carried a warmth that the house's expensive private doctors never offered. "My legs feel like lead," Noah whispered. "And the room won't stop spinning." Elena reached out, her fingers subtly finding his pulse as she adjusted his blanket. It was fast and thready. She noticed a small dish of candies on the side table, untouched. "Would you like some of that salted broth I made?" "Just a sip." Noah nodded eagerly. The boy had developed an insatiable craving for salt lately, another red flag that Elena recognized instantly. Adrenal insufficiency. Addison's disease. The symptoms were screaming at her, but in this house, she was just the woman who emptied the trash. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Elena stood up quickly, smoothing her apron. Arthur Sterling appeared in the doorway, a man of cold power and sharp suits, his face a mask of grief and exhaustion since the loss of his wife. "Elena," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Why are you hovering?" Dr. Hayes said Noah needs absolute quiet, not chatter. He stepped closer, his dark eyes suspicious as he looked from the maid to his slumped son. To Arthur, she was a necessary shadow, a servant whose only value was her silence. "I was just checking the temperature, sir," Elena replied, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered. "The draft from the window is quite strong today." Arthur looked at his son, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before the mask returned. "He's just grieving. The doctors say it's a phase. Go back to the kitchen, Elena. We have guests arriving for the gala pre-check soon." Elena hesitated. She wanted to scream that his son wasn't grieving. He was fading. She wanted to tell him that the best doctors were missing what was right in front of them. But she knew her place. "Yes, sir," she whispered. As she turned to leave, Noah let out a soft, wheezing moan and slumped deeper into the chair, his book sliding to the floor with a dull thud. Elena froze, her eyes meeting Arthur's. For the first time, she saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated terror in the powerful man's gaze. "Your expertise begins and ends with the mop in your bucket, Elena," Dr. Hayes sneered, his white coat pristine and his ego even larger. He didn't even bother to look up from his digital tablet as he adjusted the expensive sensors attached to Noah's thin chest. The medical wing of the Sterling mansion was a cathedral of modern technology, filled with the hum of high-end monitors and the scent of sterile alcohol. Yet to Elena, it felt like a room full of blind men trying to describe the sun. Elena noticed the doctor was using a standard glucose monitor, ignoring the telltale darkening of Noah's knuckles, a classic sign of Addison's that she had seen a dozen times in the ER. She stood by the door, her hands folded neatly over her gray apron, her heart heavy with a familiar frustration. 2 years ago, She had watched her own mother suffer because a specialist refused to listen to a simple nurse. Now, history was repeating itself in this cold, granite house in Vermont. Dr. Hayes, Elena began, her voice quiet but steady, have you considered checking his serum sodium and potassium levels? Or perhaps an ACTH stimulation test? The room went dead silent. The two assisting nurses gasped, and Dr. Hayes finally turned, his eyes flickering with a mixture of amusement and pure disdain. I'm sorry, did the housemaid just suggest a diagnostic protocol? Mr. Sterling, is this how you allow your staff to behave? Arthur Sterling was leaning against the far wall, his face shadowed by the dim evening light. He was clutching an old silver rosary that once belonged to his wife, his knuckles white from the pressure. He looked between the man with the Harvard degree and the woman who cleaned his floors. Elena has been with my son more than anyone else lately, Arthur said, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. Let her speak. Elena took a cautious step forward. He isn't just tired, sir. He's salt wasting. That's why he's eating from the kitchen's salt cellars when he thinks no one is looking. The hyperpigmentation on his hands. It's not a shadow. It's his body crying for help. Dr. Hayes let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Salt wasting? Addison's is a rare condition, Miss Vance. Noah is simply suffering from prolonged grief and mild anemia. I've prescribed iron supplements and high glucose juices. The sugar will only make it worse if his adrenals are failing. Elena countered, her professional authority surfacing despite the uniform she wore. Enough, Dr. Hayes snapped. Mr. Sterling, I cannot work under the scrutiny of the cleaning staff. Either she leaves or I do. Arthur looked at Noah, who lay motionless on the bed, his small face looking more like a porcelain doll than a living child. The billionaire's jaw tightened. Elena, go back to your duties in the kitchen, he commanded softly, though he wouldn't meet her eyes. Elena felt a sting of defeat, but she nodded and retreated. She knew the pride of men like Hayes was a dangerous thing, but the pride of a father was what truly worried her. Later that evening, as the house prepared for the grand gala, Elena found Noah hiding in the darkened pantry. He was sitting on the floor, his small face streaked with tears, holding a spilled container of sea salt. He was eating it with his bare fingers, his body acting on a primitive survival instinct that no expensive monitor could track. Elena, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. I don't want to go to the party. Everything is turning black. Elena knelt and pulled him into a hug, her mind racing. She had a vial of hydrocortisone tucked away in her room, a remnant of her past life, but using it without permission could land her in prison or worse, given Arthur's reputation. Just as she prepared to confront Arthur again, a loud crash echoes from the grand staircase, followed by a scream that stops her heart. The gala was meant to be a show of strength for the Sterling family, a display of opulence that defied the brutal Vermont winter, but as the power flickered and failed, the only strength left was in Elena's steady hands. The ballroom of the mansion was a sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, illuminated by the cold, flickering glow of the chandeliers until a massive surge of wind rattled the stone walls, plunging the elite of Silveridge into a disorienting darkness. Elena stood near the service entrance, her crisp white apron acting as a pale shield against the shadows. While the guests murmured in surprise, her eyes never left Noah. The boy was dressed in a miniature suit that seemed to swallow his fragile frame, his face as white as the snow piling up against the glass. Elena felt the weight of the hydrocortisone vial in her pocket, a relic she had quietly retrieved from her room earlier that evening, knowing in her soul that the boy's clock was running out. The generators will be up in a moment. Please stay calm. Arthur's voice boomed from the stage, but Elena could hear the tremor of a father's fear beneath the authority of a businessman. She noticed Marcus, the lead security guard, standing near the back of the hall. He wasn't looking at the guest list or the exits. He was staring at Noah with an expression of cold, sweating anticipation that made Elena's blood run cold. He whispered something into his radio, his eyes darting toward Dr. Hayes, who was fumbling with a flashlight near the buffet table. Noah attempted to join his father on the stage for the traditional Christmas toast, his small legs shaking with every step. He reached the first marble stair, his hands searching for a railing that wasn't there. Papa, he whispered, his voice lost in the howl of the wind outside. Before Arthur could reach him, Noah's body gave out. He collapsed mid-step, his head hitting the marble floor with a dull, terrifying thud that echoed louder than the storm. The ballroom went silent, the only sound the frantic clicking of Dr. Hayes's useless electronic monitors. "Noah!" Arthur screamed, throwing aside his glass and leaping from the stage. Dr. Hayes pushed through the crowd, his hands trembling as he checked the boy's pulse. "It's a seizure. He needs the glucose drip immediately," the doctor shouted, reaching for a bag of sugar-heavy fluids. "No." Elena's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. She pushed past a woman in diamonds, knocking aside a vase of lilies that shattered at her feet. "If you give him that sugar, you'll kill him. He's in adrenal shock." Dr. Hayes looked up, his face a mask of panicked arrogance. "Get back to the kitchen, woman. This is a medical emergency." But the lights stayed out, and in the dim glow of the emergency candles, Arthur Sterling stood between the maid and the doctor. He looked at the man with the degrees whose equipment was dead, and then at the woman who had predicted this very moment weeks ago. "Arthur, he's turning blue," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, professional calm that commanded the room. "The blizzard has blocked the mountain pass. No ambulance is coming. I have the medicine he needs right here, but I need you to trust me now, or you will lose him before the lights come back on." Arthur stared at the gun in Marcus's hand at the edge of the room, then at his dying son, and finally locked eyes with Elena. "Step aside, doctor." Arthur's voice was a low growl that carried more weight than the thunder rattling the mansion's foundation. "Let the woman who actually knows my son's heart do her work." The room, filled with the elite of Silveridge, held its collective breath as Arthur Sterling, a man who never yielded, physically moved Dr. Hayes out of the way. Elena didn't wait for another word. She dropped to her knees on the cold marble ballroom floor, her movements becoming a rhythmic grace that she hadn't felt since her days in the Boston ER. In the dim, flickering light of the emergency candles, she was no longer a maid in a gray uniform. She was a commander in a field of chaos. "I need saline, a clean syringe, and the vial from my apron pocket now," Elena commanded, her voice cutting through the ozone-heavy air. While the other nurses stood paralyzed, Arthur himself knelt to help her, his tailored suit jacket discarded on the floor. Elena's hands were steady as she drew the hydrocortisone. She ignored the judgmental whispers of the guests and the indignant huffing of Dr. Hayes. "His blood pressure is crashing," Elena narrated calmly to Arthur, her fingers pressed against Noah's neck. "His body's engine has simply run out of fuel. This isn't a seizure. It's an adrenal crisis." She administered the injection with a precision that made the humiliated Dr. Hayes look like an amateur. Minutes felt like hours in the heavy silence of the storm-battered mansion. Elena watched Noah's face with an intensity that ignored the entire world around them. Slowly, the gray, waxy pallor of his skin began to recede, replaced by a faint, healthy flush of pink. His rapid, shallow gasps smoothed into a steady, rhythmic breathing. "He's coming back," Elena whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Then it happened. In the quiet of the darkened ballroom, Noah's long eyelashes flickered. He opened his eyes, looking past his father, past the doctors, and straight at Elena. A tiny weak hand reached out and found hers. "I knew you'd come for me, Elena," the boy whispered, his voice small but clear. The room exhaled in a single, massive wave of relief. Arthur Sterling looked at Elena with a gratitude so profound it was almost terrifying, his eyes moist with tears he hadn't shed in years. But as the emergency lights finally flickered back to life, Arthur's gaze suddenly shifted toward the service entrance. His expression hardened into a mask of lethal ice as he spotted Marcus, the lead security guard, trying to slip away through the shadows with his radio clutched tight in his sweating palm. The cold in the library had nothing to do with the Vermont blizzard and everything to do with the stack of suppressed medical reports Arthur held in his shaking hand. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the leather-bound books, but the warmth couldn't reach the icy resolve in Arthur's eyes. He had spent the last hour reviewing the internal logs Elena had urged him to find, and the truth was more bitter than the winter air outside. Elena stood by the desk, her presence a calm anchor in the room. She had noticed Marcus's nervous habit of checking his watch throughout the night, a detail she now realized was a countdown to Noah's expected accident. It wasn't just medical negligence. It was a slow, calculated execution hidden behind white coats and security badges. "He was my cousin, Elena," Arthur whispered, his voice hollow as he looked at the name Marcus on a payroll sheet for a rival organization. "I trusted him with my son's life while I grieved for Maria. And all the while, he was ensuring I'd lose the only piece of her I had left." Elena moved closer, placing a hand on the cold mahogany desk. "Grief can blind us to the wolves at the door, Arthur. But you aren't blind anymore." Arthur looked up at her, the flickering firelight reflecting the raw vulnerability on his face. For the first time, the boss was gone, replaced by a man who had stared into the abyss and been pulled back by a woman the world told him to ignore. "Why did you stay? You could have left with your dignity months ago when Hayes first insulted you." "Because no one should have to say goodbye when there's still a chance to say, 'I love you,'" Elena replied softly, her voice carrying the weight of her own past losses. "I couldn't save my mother from the doctors who didn't care, but I could save Noah. And I knew you were a man worth saving too." The moment between them stretched, electric and solemn. Arthur stood and took her hand, his rough palm a contrast to her steady, soft touch. He realized then that the maid who had cleaned his house had actually been the only one keeping it from crumbling into ash. The silence was broken by the sharp ring of Arthur's private phone. It was the representative of the rival family, calling to check if the tragedy had been completed. Arthur answered, his voice returning to the lethal, controlled tone that Silveridge feared. But this time, he was fighting for a future, not just protecting a past. He declared that his house was no longer divided, and that Elena Vance was now under his personal protection not as an employee, but as the soul of the Sterling family. Arthur hung up the phone and looked at Elena, a glimmer of hope finally breaking through his exhaustion. He took her hand again and asked her to help him build a future where Noah wouldn't just survive, but thrive, starting with a name for a new clinic that would never turn a blind eye to the truth. The lavender fields of Vermont didn't care about family names or past sins. They only bloomed for those who took the time to water them. The mid-July sun bathed the Sterling estate in a golden hue, a stark and beautiful contrast to the frozen, desperate night of the blizzard 3 years ago. Looking at the polished brass sign of the Vance Memorial Clinic at the edge of the estate, Elena remembered the day she was fired for being too caring, realizing that the very trait that had once broken her life was the one that had saved it now. She was no longer wearing the gray maid's uniform. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant sundress, though her eyes still held the same sharp, observant spark of the nurse who saw what others missed. Noah, now a healthy and vibrant 9-year-old, ran across the porch, his skin glowing with vitality. He held up a sketchbook filled with intricate drawings of local birds, his hands steady and strong. "Mama, look. I finally found the blue jay near the creek," he shouted, his voice full of the childhood joy that had almost been extinguished. The word mama still sent a swell of emotion through Elena's heart. She had officially adopted him a year after the wedding, a final seal on the bond formed in the shadows of the library. Arthur emerged from the house, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. The hard lines of the Mafia Boss had softened into those of a man at peace, a man who had restructured his world to protect the family he had nearly lost. He sat beside Elena, his hand finding hers with an effortless familiarity. They watched the community gathering in the garden below, local townspeople who now received care at Elena's clinic, funded entirely by the Sterling fortune as a debt of gratitude that could never truly be repaid. "You're thinking about that night again, aren't you?" Arthur asked quietly, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "I was thinking about how lucky I was that you finally looked at me," Elena replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. Arthur presented Elena with a small, worn key, the key to her old, cramped apartment in the city, and told her she never had to go back, because she had become the very heart and soul of this home. He reminded her that she was never just the maid. She was the silent sentinel who had saved them all with nothing but salt and courage. As the sun set behind the Green Mountains, Elena looked out at the horizon, a peaceful smile on her face, knowing that kindness always finds its way home. As the golden embers of the Vermont sunset fade behind the Green Mountains, we are reminded that the most powerful medicine isn't always found in a sterile vial or a prestigious degree. In the quiet courage of Elena Vance, We see that when we look past a person's uniform or the color of their skin, we often find a hero waiting to be seen. Just like a steady lamp in a dark window, a single act of unconditional kindness can guide an entire family through life's coldest storms and lead them safely home. Take a moment today to cherish the quiet hearts around you, for you never know which soul might hold the light you'll one day need. If this story has touched your heart, perhaps a simple smile or a helping hand to a stranger today can kindle a warmth that lasts a lifetime.